Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're always glad to have you with us. By now, most of us know, especially if you're listening to a college football podcast in May, you almost certainly know that the college football playoff is expanding this upcoming season from 4 to 12 teams. My partner Shehan, along with his CBS colleague Dennis Dodd, put together an interesting article looking at 10 complications, potentially unforeseen complications, that fans must prepare for. We're going to take a look at those and talk about them today. But before we dive in, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment if you can to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. And first, before we dive into it, let me encourage everyone to go check out this article at cbssports.com and the other articles by my great co-host. There's always interesting ones. There's more recent ones that I've also enjoyed, but we're going to talk about this one as we get into this. So what was the genesis of this article? What led you and Dennis to write it?
Well, so I went to the college football playoff meetings 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's not a lot of quote unquote news came from it, to be clear, right? Like, this is just one of those things where everybody's in the same place. And so you really just need to enjoy that opportunity, especially when that same place is Dallas, Texas, from my perspective. And so it was great. You know, it was the first time that some of these people had worked together in the same room, because Tim Pernetti coming in as new AAC commissioner, he was there. You have, you know, even in the Pac-12, they parted ways with George Kliavkov. Now you have Teresa Gold coming in. She's going to be a member of the management committee for the next 2 years because the Pac-12 is written into the contract. So just a lot of movement, a lot of new faces. Actually, the other piece too, General Richard Clark, the new executive director, as of June of the college football playoff, was also there, kind of taking part in his first in-person big meeting. So it was great. I mean, it's just like a period of transition, right? The one person who wasn't there, MAC Commissioner John Steinbrecher, actually was not there because his wife unfortunately recently passed away. So they sent their deputy commissioner. But that's part of, I think, why also there was no real way that a major change was going to happen. I mean, John Steinbrecher is up there with the most respected members of the CFP management committee. So it was a great opportunity, though, just to get to talk to people. And actually at the end, so last year, I think it was last year, I don't know, time moves crazy these days. Last year, I took part in the college football playoff mock selection committee, which they hold every year for media members. So they kind of did like a mini version of it in the room, and they actually let the couple of media members who were there actually do a similar thing after the fact. And so they worked with the 2022 final CFP rankings. They did make the sort of difference that, hey, let's just treat the conferences like it is the, you know, heading forward, right? That it is like the 2024 alignment. So ultimately, they treated Utah, for example, as the Big 12 champion. They did not treat Kansas State as the Big 12 champion, just for the purposes of the exercise, right? And it turns out that it's like kind of complicated once you actually get into things and you actually start doing things to put this whole project together. And the reason that you ultimately do it, right, is it's not just necessarily trying to put the teams in order, right? Because we were given the top 25. It's a combination of the order, which is the first, of course, way that they kind of address things. But then it's also turning rankings into seedings. Those are words that you're going to hear over and over and over again come the fall. Ranking versus seeding, they are two different things. They are not the same thing. And that's going to throw some people off. I can promise you that. Actually, I'll tease an article that may be out by the time that you're listening to this podcast. I think it's scheduled to come out Thursday, where I'm actually taking Dennis Dodd's post-spring top 25 for CBS Sports and essentially putting them in where they would be in the college football playoff, where they'd be ranked, what matchups they'd likely go to, what bowls they'd be sent to most likely. And again, it's going to throw some people off. So I think I wanted to just come in and get ahead of it. Here are some of the biggest things I think that that people are going to be confused by. Now, look, this is a college football playoff show. We've talked about this quite a bit. So I don't necessarily know that all of our listeners are going to be total novices to what we're about to say. But I still think it's good to kind of go in and say, hey, these are things that maybe your friends even might not expect. Or if you're newer to our podcast, maybe you don't necessarily understand the mechanics of some of this. And also, by the way, even during the meetings, I cover this for a living. I learned some stuff as well. So I think it's going to be a great opportunity to get into that.
Absolutely. And, just kind of refresh people's memories or teach people who may not be familiar about the basic playoff format. Again, we're going to 12 teams that'll make up the expanded CFP. They're going to be the top 5 conference champs. So in practicality, it's going to be the remaining P4 plus whichever of the G5 champs is ranked the highest. And if they're not ranked, then they kind of go through their secret meetings. We'll get to that maybe later. And then 7 at-large teams. Maybe in the past you'd heard this as the 5+7 model when they were trying to figure out what to do with the elimination of the Pac-12. Now, the 4 highest ranked conference champions, presumably the P4, but in a wild world, you could see a year where a P4 champ is ranked lower than the G5 champ, like the Cincinnati season, for example. Those top 4 conference champs are going to be the top 4 seeds no matter what. So if the top 4, if the 4th is ranked below the top 4, they're still going to be one of the top 4 seeds. And those top 4 seeds are important because they get buys. So the remaining 8 teams will be seeded in order, and then they will play the first round games. So seeds 5 through 8 will host seeds 9 through 12 in first round games on campus, which has got a lot of people excited because those are going to be the on-campus playoff games. And then the winners of those are going to head to the quarterfinals against those initial top 4 seeded teams in the New Year's 6. 4 of the New Year's 6 will be quarterfinals. 2 of them will be semifinals. And then we'll do the classic national championship as a rotating site that's been bidded for. This year, it's going to be Atlanta at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. So that's what the playoff format is. All of that we've known for a while. But again, as we've just said, I think a lot of fans are going to be surprised by some of the nuances and some of the consequences of this. Now, what was the one that struck you the most?
I'm going to go back to it. It's rankings versus seedings. That is going to get people. And I actually am going to fold in one of the other points in this article, and that's how the final rankings are revealed. And the reason that I say that is because if you are the number 2 team in the country, let's just say, right, Alabama and Georgia are the number 1 and number 2 team in the country. You, being Alabama, might think, oh, we are number 2. We get a bye. We get the opportunity to not have to play that first weekend. No, that's not how it's going to work. You are not a conference champion in this scenario. So number 1, Georgia gets the bye, and number 2, Alabama in this scenario would only be number 5 in the seedings. They'd be the 5 seed. Now, we have precedent for this with college basketball, of course, where teams that are ranked higher don't necessarily get the top seeds. But what's different is in college basketball, they release a full rankings list, and generally speaking, the rankings that they release are in order, right? Like the 31st team is the 7th seed or whatever, right? And the other piece is that we have built-in buys, so it's guaranteed that no matter what the ranking is, that their seeding might be different. So this is why I go back to the ESPN broadcast. I did see actually some people talking, and some people were like, well, like, why would we care about like what maximizes ESPN's television dollars and how they release it? And that's not the point that I'm making here. The point that I'm making here is the way that ESPN decides to release the final rankings might make a difference in whether people understand the actual system. right? Because if we're in a scenario where they release just the top 25 like they've done before, 25-1, which is possible, they're still discussing how they're going to do it. They haven't made a decision on that as yet. If they just release it 25-1 and then say, okay, time to reseed, then again, we might be in a position where fans in Tuscaloosa are like, we thought we were celebrating getting a bye. I started buying my tickets to the bowl game, or whatever, right? But all of a sudden, you're telling me now we're the 5 seed, but we're also hosting a game. But I didn't think we'd be hosting a game because that's not how I thought this worked. It could create major confusion for people, and I think that is going to be a huge thing that the College Football Playoff Committee and ESPN are going to need to be cognizant of. Now, I expect that the way that they'll try to address this is from the very first release, basically coming up with the top 25 rankings and then saying, now here's what the bracket would look like, right? Like, I think that's how they would probably handle it ultimately. But the first time that the rankings are released and number 17, North Carolina, is the 4 seed, and number 2, Alabama, is the 5 seed, that's going to upset some people, and get ready for it now.
We're going to get all the hot takes from people who don't pay attention to the sport, like all the big sports names that have no idea what college football is really about. I can't wait. You pointed something out when you were discussing how the bracket reveal was going to be. You made the joke that the graphics operator is briefly the most powerful person in college football because they get the preview of what everyone else is about to see. But I think they also are going to play a certain amount of value in the run up to it because I'm a visual person. A lot of people are visual people. I think if they can come up with a good graphic that sort of explains it as well, maybe, some visualization. I'm not going to come up with it right now. That could help. And I would not be shocked, especially, I think, frankly, we've just given every announcing team in America is going to now have something for filler time, in the middle of the game to discuss. So let's talk about, you can imagine, let's talk about the new playoff rankings, how they're going to work. You throw that graphic on as they're killing time during a timeout or something if they decided not to go to commercial. There will be, I think, a lot of opportunities to hopefully educate it. But you're right, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be missed. I mean, the giant audiences that show up for those final games in the season, especially rivalry games, because those are the games they may still care about if they're not as passionate about college football in the regular season in general, or obviously the conference title games and those playoff games, are going to wonder, how on earth did we get here? And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how they can be educated on that. Because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It makes sense. And that's the thing. The actual system makes sense, which is frustrating about whether they change it to 16 or 14. But this makes sense. So hopefully it's a tall order. Hopefully they can make that work. But I agree that the idea of ranking and seeding is going to be fascinating. Because I know in one of our earlier shows, we were talking about, we did that initial, super early ranking seeding thing. And I think you had Louisville and I had Utah as kind of these oddball teams in there. And I remember some of the reactions that I read when it was posted on Reddit were like, wait, well, why? What are you guys smoking? It's like, no, we think they're going to win that conference. And therefore, they're going to have to be one of those top 4 teams because we just assume there isn't going to be a Cincinnati-style season where G5 is going to come suddenly jump ahead of one of those teams. And I want to say, though, we're not going to get, because before the show we were talking about this briefly. I grew up, I was already in college. I was around when there was one of the most notorious Rose Bowl matchups because Stanford under Tyrone Willingham, bless them, in '99, they managed to go 7-1 in the Pac-10 and lock the Rose Bowl rankings when they were unranked. They were ranked for the Rose Bowl, but they were ranked number 22. I don't think that's possible anymore, mostly because, again, most of the big conferences have gotten away with divisions. So we're going to get the top 2 teams in these conference title games. So you're not going to get, the sacrificial Big Ten West team going and getting absolutely blown out by the Big Ten East behemoth. We're going to get good conference matchups in the title game. So I think at the very worst, we're going to end up with maybe a team that isn't quite as highly ranked, but in a way, it'll probably block out many of those opportunities for G5 to jump ahead. That's absolutely an interesting one. And I think those two together. I'm really fascinated to see how they present it, though. There's a lot of potential here, and I think this is going to be more Disney than ESPN in terms of, maybe they'll do that tie-in. Maybe they can bring, like, Snow White can come out and reveal it, take a bite of the apple, and then reveal what's inside. I don't know. I'm going off kilter here.
What are you talking about?
Oh my goodness! But what would be another one? What's one of the other areas you think that might surprise people once we get into the next season?
So over the next 2 years, there's going to be a little bit of weirdness in college football bowl placement. And the reason that I say that is that I didn't realize this until I did this mock selection exercise. Teams that are in like major conferences that have tie-ins with bowl games, with the major New Year's Six games, they'll actually have those tie-ins heading into the field. So what that means is, okay, let's say the top four is Georgia, Michigan, whatever, Clemson, and Kansas State, right? Well, Georgia, actually, this upcoming year, one of the semifinal or one of the quarterfinal games is actually the Peach Bowl in Atlanta, right in Georgia's backyard. But Georgia, as an SEC team, would be prioritized to the Sugar Bowl because that's the team that has historical ties. And so, for example, if you're Rutgers and maybe the idea of playing in the Orange Bowl on the East Coast is more attractive to you, it doesn't matter. You're going to get prioritized to the Rose Bowl because you're a Big Ten team. One that came up was, what if the Rose Bowl and Orange Bowl happened to both be semifinals, and for whatever reason, Cal was the number one team in the country? Well, they wouldn't get to play in Los Angeles. They'd have to play in Orlando because of their ACC ties, because of realignment. So it ends up being a very strange predicament, ultimately. And this will only be the case for the next 2 years, because what people need to remember is that for these next 2 years, with an expanded 12-team playoff, we're in a situation where the contracts that Bulls signed with teams still exist. They were set to expire after the 2025 campaign, so that the entire college football playoff could go and be up for negotiation once again, essentially. But these contracts still exist for the next 2 years. Now, look, if hypothetically, let's say that no Big Ten team made the field, like, then priority would not be as important. But if there is a Big Ten team, they will get priority. The thing that is interesting too, of course, is that the Sugar Bowl contracts with the Big 12 and the SEC. So the higher ranked of those teams would get there. So if Kansas State was the 1 seed and Georgia was the 2 seed, Kansas State would head to the Sugar Bowl, for example, and then the priority wouldn't be the same for Georgia as the number 2 team. So it's going to be weird. Again, I have an article coming out tomorrow projecting how that might go. And one of these scenarios is Georgia heading to the Sugar Bowl and not the Peach Bowl because of that historic tie. So I think that's going to confuse some people. Now, I will say too, bowl selection in the grand scheme of things, not that huge of a priority, right? Like, that's not going to be something that completely blows people's minds whenever it happens, like maybe the buys and the seeding, but it's going to be weird. And it's something that even as someone who covered the sport, I didn't realize until I went and did that mock selection exercise.
Yeah, that was one of the surprising things I noticed in the article. And it made me kind of wonder, because again, you just said the selection committee must take into account existing bowl contracts. What if, because these happened in the quarters and the semis, is the tie-in really only for that higher ranked team? So really, we're only talking about the conference champs, which makes it a little cleaner. But as you pointed out, the Big 12 and the SEC share that one bowl, so it would only be the higher ranked one, because presumably that other conference champ would fill in one of the other spots. Because obviously we're going to the more likely potential, rather than no Big Ten teams making, is 2 Big Ten teams are going to make it through after that first round. So you'll have the Big Ten champ that had the bye, and then you'll have potentially 1 or even more at-large teams that made it through. At that point, those teams are not affected by this. Am I to understand that correctly?
Yes. So because what people need to understand is that the bracket will essentially be made, it's my understanding, with the like higher ranked team in mind, right? So what that means is, okay, in the quarters, Georgia would go to the Sugar or whatever, right? And the semi, so actually let's say in this scenario that the semi is a Sugar Bowl, right? That the Sugar Bowl is hosting a semi that year. Georgia would be prioritized there on the brackets. Now let's say Georgia gets upset, right? Let's say that Georgia gets upset by Ohio State and the 2 seed is Maryland, right? Like they would still, it's my understanding, be sent to the Sugar Bowl because that's essentially Georgia's region is how it would be treated. And so a lot of moving parts, a lot of weirdness to it. I mean, look, the reality is you as a school need to have the logistics in mind of how you're going to handle the entire college football playoff. That's why that would be a priority, because you need to be able to say, okay, well, if we're the 6th seed, okay, we're going to host this game. We're going to be preparing to host this game on the first round. Then we have to be prepared to go to this site, and then we have to be prepared to go to this site, as opposed to saying like, oh, well, Georgia lost, and this is now a Big Ten team. Oh, we're going to change where this bracket's going to the Rose Bowl. So that's my understanding of it.
Now, we could always go and then speak to our friends in the SEC and say, imagine that after the quarterfinals, all we have left are SEC teams, because the SEC team won, and all those SEC at-large teams just plowed through that weak competition. So we're going to have an all-SEC semifinals. My goodness. Oh gosh. And you know, the crazy thing is that's not all that impossible. I can't even imagine what's going to happen if that occurred. And again, yeah, the scary thing is it's totally plausible. But you know, it brings up though one of the other points that you and Dennis brought up, and I know you wrote up this section. We're going to get the potential for something that we've seen before, but I think on a greater level, and that's conference game rematches. Obviously, again, we saw it happen a couple of times with the SEC in the championship game, most recently in Indianapolis when Georgia beat Alabama to win their first of those back-to-back titles. What do you think fans will think about that? I mean, do you think it will feel less weird because it is a bigger expanded playoff than it was when it was 4 spots, and to the annoyance of some people, 2 teams from the same conference made it in?
Well, I think that's a big piece of it, right? Is that we have kind of, I think college football in general has this obsession with, we don't do rematches. We don't, because it's supposed to be one big marquee game. It's not supposed to be played over and over again. And there's a reality where the game could be played 3 times in 4 games, right? Where you have the final week of the regular season, where you have the conference championship game, and then potentially the next game, the second round of the college football playoff. So that's just something we're going to have to get used to. But I do also think that we've started transitioning to feel more okay about it, because I didn't see many people complaining that we got Washington, Oregon Part 2 last year, right? Like that was a great game that I think everybody ultimately was happy to see again. And this has existed in every system that we've had since we've had national championship games. 2011, Alabama versus LSU was a rematch in the national title game in a 2-team tournament, right? They picked 1 and 2 all over again as the same 2 teams that already played. In the 4-team playoff, we've already seen rematches. We saw Georgia-Alabama rematch in the 2021 national championship game. So I think it's going to be weird the first time that we see it. One thing that's been proposed is, can we tell the committee to prioritize not having first round rematches necessarily? And because actually we did the bracket exercise, and in 2022, I believe it would have been number 6 Ohio State versus number 11. 6th seed. I need to be careful with my verbiage, because obviously that's going to confuse people. 6th seed Ohio State versus 11th seed Penn State, which was a game that was played in the regular season. That would have been a first round matchup. I think that I don't know that I love the idea of having a policy against it, because I just think that would make things a little weird. And how are you supposed to rank teams if you're prioritizing one thing over the other? My hope is that like the committee just has some common sense about it that, oh, hey, maybe so weird. We actually thought that Penn State was the 10th best team and not the 11th, so we avoid the rematch. But I mean, the other piece of this too is that historically, it's been a huge priority from the NCAA basketball tournament committee to avoid as many rematches as possible through like the Elite Eight and, you know, and try to prioritize only getting them in the Final Four. But like now we're in a world where like the Big 12 gets 9 or 10 teams in, and it's impossible to avoid everybody. So they try to just avoid the first weekend, putting teams in the same area and having rematches. It's just harder with college football because it's only 12 teams, and you look at the size of these conferences right now. I mean, the Big 10 is 18 teams, the ACC 17, Big 12 and SEC are 16. Like that's basically with individual exceptions. I mean, like I don't even know if it'll happen. 11 of the 12 teams are going to come from 4 conferences, and the vast majority are going to come from 2 conferences. So I don't know how you make that happen necessarily to completely avoid rematches in the college football playoff, even in the first round. I think it'll take people a second. I would like the playoff committee in an off-the-record way to try to maybe nudge one way or the other, especially to try to avoid games that were played very recently. I think one of the reasons that the Oregon game, for example, against Washington was pretty well received is because the first version of it was in the middle of October, and we didn't get it again until December. If it's like, that's going to be one that's tough about the game, right? Is that if they play in the last week of the regular season and then they play in the Big Ten title game, they're playing back-to-back weeks. I think that part is going to feel a little weird. I don't anticipate that they'd move it off of that weekend just because it's such an event that it's the last game, last week of the regular season on Rivalry Sunday, or Rivalry Saturday, sorry. But I think that games that aren't as entrenched as that game that might have conference title implications, we might see some movement. Oklahoma State was one in the Big 12 that historically had been played very late in the year, way into November, and they actually moved it a little earlier because there was a chance for a rematch. And it actually never happened, which is kind of strange. In the Big 12 conference championship game era, they never played once again in the title game, but I do think that was a legitimate consideration. And for games that aren't the literal Ohio State-Michigan game, you know, I mean, Auburn's doing its part to avoid this in the Iron Bowl by not being very good. But like, I think that outside of those individual exceptions, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these November rivalry games maybe move a little bit earlier to try to avoid like the back-to-back thing. I think that's when you'd really run into some problems, is when they play so close together.
I hold out hope for that wild season where somehow Army-Navy end up playing 3 times because for those who don't know, actually, they're now both in the American. And Army and Navy will play after the conference title game, which theoretically could include them both. And then if somehow they are completely undefeated, there is that theoretical possibility where they just end up both in the playoff, which would be spectacular.
Well, and I'll say this. So that was actually one thing that one of the true news items that came out of the CFP meetings. So Army Navy, the game, will not be taken under consideration for the college football playoff. It's going to be considered essentially an outside event. And the reason for that, because historically with the 4-team playoff, if there were playoff implications involving Army and Navy, the committee would actually wait. They would not name their final 4 until that game was resolved. Now, look, all respect to the troops, troop respecter over here, of course. It wasn't all that likely that Army or Navy was going to be a top 4 team in the country. And it's probably still not likely that they're going to, in this scenario, it's that they would both be, top 11, 12 teams in the country that either would have a chance at an at-large bid. I do think it's possible that one of them could have a year that gets them into the Group of Five conversation. But then again, like then you've played the conference title game already, so it's not that big a deal. But yeah, it is a little bit of an oddity that there is a game that is explicitly not going to be considered by the College Football Playoff Committee. And I talked to Mike Oresco, the AAC commissioner, after that happened, and he was basically like, yeah, look, I mean, it's not realistic to think that the committee can just wait and then the very next week everybody be ready to play the college football playoff, right? Like you need that week of buffer just to plan even logistics for playing in the college football playoff. And so even though he is like, he's the guy who's the there to advocate for them, even he was like, yeah, whatever.
Oh, man, I love it. Well, we'll get back in a second to talk more of the kind of logistical quirks that are going to come with the 12-team playoff here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So, yeah, bringing up the logistical angle, there are a couple of quirks that are going to come here. Number one is moving from on-campus to the on-campus model for these first-round playoffs. Everyone's excited about them, but are the teams and are some of these programs truly ready for what will happen if they host some of these games and the caliber of these games come this year?
Well, it's going to be fascinating because it's not just the logistics of hosting a game, it's the logistics of hosting a game at a completely inopportune time relative to the rest of the college football calendar, because these games are going to largely take place after the school semester is over, right? We're getting into December. One thing that my colleague Dennis Dodd pointed out is that think of a school like Penn State, which could easily be a school that's hosting a college football playoff game. Their commencement is oftentimes the same weekend as a potential college football playoff game. So you've got people coming in town for that. And on top of that, it's not like there's a lot of extra room available in State College. This was actually something that happened this past year in the March Madness tournament on the men's and women's side, actually, was that Gonzaga women's basketball had a great season. They ended up hosting one of the first two round sites in Spokane. But the complication was that, one, there was another conference, I believe, and two, Spokane was set to be the site of a men's basketball regional, one of the Sweet 16 and Elite Eights. So when Utah women's basketball came into town, there were not essentially enough rooms available close by. So they had to go stay in northern Idaho, which was 30 minutes away from Spokane. And while they were there, they were subject to some racist attacks. And now, of course, look, I think that there's a bigger conversation to be had about like, hey man, hey Northern Idaho, what are we doing here? Like, there shouldn't be a place that's a pretty major city that people are subject to this stuff for being a bunch of black people in a state. Like, that's obviously insane. But the bigger picture with this is they are not built to handle a giant crowd, and especially competing giant crowds. So now let's just say for Penn State, right, you're in a position where tons and tons of people are coming to State College for graduation. And then also tons and tons of people are coming to State College for a potential college football playoff game. Now, Dennis suggests, well, maybe they'll move it to a neutral site. No way. That is not happening. I'm not the one writing that section of the article. I seriously doubt that there's any scenario where they moved a game to Pittsburgh or to Philadelphia.
Did they ever carve out that? Because I remember when they first started talking about this, they said and you could tell they were basically implying that in the wild scenario where a very unexpected G5 champ ends up hosting. So let's say a smaller MAC school or App State, because Boone is a pretty remote spot. And they're a plausible one that could get in there. If they somehow end up hosting and their logistics just make it impossible to play the game, they would be open to moving it, but they never went into the details. It was just kind of like an implied like, okay, well then Boone could move it to Charlotte or something like that. Did they ever elaborate on any of that, or is that just sort of still kind of hovering in the background What did they say?
So I think that it's essentially, I don't know if it's been enumerated, but I think it's sort of unspoken, the idea that you have the right to move the game if you want to.
But who would want to do that?
Like one that I'd be, yeah, well, one thing that I'd be curious about, right, is a team like Ohio State, where, yeah, of course, I mean, I don't think that they'd move it from Ohio Stadium. I don't, because I think it just means too much to have another game there and a playoff game there. But like their offense is made to play in a dome, right? Like their offense goes crazy once you put it in a dome. You see them play in Indianapolis in Big Ten title games versus even playing a team like Michigan outside. Like it just, they're not as built to do that. And so like it actually would be a strategic advantage for them, even if they could host a first round game, to not. Now, again, the money, the attention, I don't think that it would be embarrassing, I think, too, for a school to turn it down, especially one that has the capability to host it. But like, I think that's a legitimate question that needs to be asked. And, you know, I know there's so many Big Ten teams, especially, that are going to be chomping at the bit like, yes, we want you to have to play in the snow. We want you to have to play in the cold. Et cetera, et cetera.
Could you imagine Syracuse if they got the host say, no, not in the Carrier Dome. We're moving this to Buffalo. That would be spectacular.
That's the real other piece. Teams moving out of the dome. But no, I mean, that's going to be, I think, a fascinating dynamic of like, look, guess what? Michigan would like to play in the cold. They would definitely like to play in the cold. Like if Wisconsin starts really getting cooking with their air raid offense stuff, is that like, do they want to necessarily be playing outside? Probably. I mean, that's, I don't know, it's the most amazing example, but like, it's a question, right? Like
one aspect people may not be realizing here, and it came up in Minnesota in the oddest way. A lot of these stadiums in college are built, you know, they put a lot of bells and whistles in them. But they're always thinking, okay, our season ends by the end of November, typically. So when they built what is now called Huntington Bank Stadium, it's not that old of a stadium. When they built this new stadium and moved the Gophers out of the Metrodome, it was never built to deal with the extreme cold. At least it can handle it, but it was never designed to be hosting games. So some of you may remember the Metrodome roof popped one year in a heavy snow, and the Vikings had to temporarily move to what was then TCF Bank Stadium. They did not have a heated field. They never thought they would need one. So Brett Favre famously got a concussion when he got tackled on that rock hard field. Now, when they decided to build what is now US Bank Stadium, they went ahead and the Vikings paid to put in like a lot of amenities into the stadium for over playing in the depth of winter. So now they have a heated field at that stadium. But I'm wondering, are there going to be a couple of fields out there, a couple of stadiums out there where they're going to be like, ooh, we've never actually run this thing in that kind of weather later in the season? Because while typically speaking, living here in the upper Midwest, December isn't too bad. Every now and again, you get hit by that crazy weather. So, my goodness, wouldn't that be glorious? I mean, all we have to look is to the FCS playoffs. Those guys, every now and again, Montana will host a game. And I remember it was like maybe 10 years ago where all the fans were wearing ski masks so their eyes wouldn't freeze. And that was just some of the greatest photography I've ever seen out of that game. I mean, we could end up with a wild one like that.
Well, and I think that another piece, just again, when you talk about pure logistics that gets overlooked a little bit, is it's one thing, because like you said, December's kind of the start of when it gets bad in in the Midwest and in the North, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you said that December's not that bad in Minnesota. I live in Texas. I'm sure that I'm sure that I could not handle whatever the hell you got going on up there. But I think that one thing that kind of gets lost is, okay, so you get further into December, it obviously starts getting worse, right? Like you're getting into legitimate winter at that point. And yes, these stadiums are made for winter, kind of, but like you have to deal with the actual logistics of 100,000 people maybe actually coming in the snow to come to Michigan Stadium or to come to Ohio Stadium, right? Like it sounds awesome in theory, but I'm going to be curious too. Are we going to see programs that often host these games start to like try to upgrade their stadium to prepare for it? Like, is that something that we might start to need? I'd be curious too if we get to maybe the quarterfinals start being more often at home fields, because that's one thing is when teams have a bye, they don't actually get a home playoff game. Like Georgia, if they're number one, they will not get a home playoff game at Sanford Stadium. It's a weird quirk of the system, but it's reality. So anyway, all this to say, I mean, ultimately, again, I find it very unlikely that any team or stadium will turn down the opportunity to host a playoff game because, I mean, you mentioned App State, right? App State, if they got the chance to finish number 8 and host a playoff game in Boone, North Carolina, like what marketing for the school, right? Like what an opportunity that would be to have everybody converge on that stadium. But again, then you have to, even I think that one piece is like, because again, Ohio State and the big stadiums can obviously handle this up and the newer stadiums. But even among power conference schools, like imagine a scenario where you need the level of television production that the college football playoff requires, and they have to bring it to insert X place, right? Like insert middle of nowhere place. Let's say, I know that they're doing a renovation right now, right? But like, let's say that Kansas finishes number 8 in the country and you got to bring all that stuff to Lawrence. Oh my gosh, right? Like that's complicated.
Oh, please Northwestern. Please Northwestern in the next 2 years host a playoff game.
We need the first round sites this upcoming year to be Northwestern, Kansas, and Vanderbilt. That's what we need more than anything, so that there will be 12s of people at all of those games.
They're going to have to like bring boats around that Northwestern field just to have things to even aim at that stadium they're trying to do. Oh my goodness. We have found the ultimate chaos scenario for the college football playoff in the next couple of years. I love it. Speaking of other kind of logistical quirks, and this is more of the broadcasting quirk, the NFL, and you brought it up in your part of it. Can you explain to us what kind of conflicts we're going to be dealing with the playoff going up against the NFL playoff?
Yeah, so the NFL starting in like early December, whenever college football is relatively done in earnest, is allowed to start playing games on Saturdays. That's why you see them start to do it, when it comes to early December or whatever it is. And that's actually part of an antitrust settlement with the federal government that they negotiated and decreed. Essentially, you are not allowed to play. Like this is the earliest you're allowed to play. This is the earliest you're allowed to play starting on Saturdays. They actually this past year, they finally played their first game on Black Friday, right up against at the earliest that they're allowed to do it, because it's like 3 p.m. on Black Friday is the earliest they are allowed to have a game. And of course, all this is encroaching on college football, like Saturdays for college football, but they don't care. The NFL wants to be ultimately like a 7-day-a-week league. They want to own every piece of airwave that they are legally allowed to get away with, which to me sucks, but that's a whole other conversation. So in the expanded playoff, we are going to have I believe the next 2 years, it's one Friday semifinal, one Friday first round game, and then 3 Saturday ones. Basically, one in each of the television windows: the 12, the 3:30, the 7, or whatever it is. And the NFL, like you said, is going to be deep into the regular season at that point, maybe even borderline playoffs by that point. I think it's still end of the regular season at that point, but what's going to end up happening is you are going to have college football playoff games going head to head with the NFL. And the NFL is reportedly not happy about this. What I'd say is this is not going to go well for college football. Like when you see some of the ratings from, the 3:30 or 7 game, and you're like, wait, nobody watched this. Don't think that that's about the college football playoff. That's because they're going head to head with the NFL, and it's not going to go well. We did ask Bill Hancock about it at the meeting, and he's just like logistically, there's no way. We thought about can we play more games on Friday? Can we play some games on Thursday? But it just doesn't make sense. And I mean, the other thing too is that when you start, I mean, I think it's like December 13th or something like that is the first Saturday that there are college football playoff games. Like December 11th, that Thursday, that's just like a day. That's just like a normal day. You can't just be encroaching on people's lives like that, frankly, for what should be a tentpole event for you. And so, yeah, I think that you just do, if you're the college football playoff, you just have to ride with it. You have to roll with it. You have to hope that people are double screening it. You have to hope that the games are. And I mean, the other thing too, right, is that by that point in the year, a lot of teams are eliminated from the NFL playoffs. A lot of teams are not necessarily going to have good matchups remaining. And so I think that you just have to hope that you can win how you can. But again, when we do end up in a position, and we will, where college football ratings come out from that Saturday and we're like, oh, there's no interest in the playoff, just to understand that's what's happening.
You know, I mean, I'm going to be curious to see if we get some regular season games just aren't that exciting in the NFL at that late of a stage. Maybe the teams already know where they're going and it's kind of a meaningless game. You might see some benefit, but it reminds me of, and this is going back to the second year of a college football playoff, the 14 playoff, where it seemed doomed from the start, but dang, did the college football playoff and ESPN try their hardest. They pulled out every stop. I remember Jimmy Kimmel was a sponsor, and they were trying to, like, not sponsor, but the spokesman, where they were trying to get everybody to watch the 2 semifinals on New Year's Eve. I remember the big ad campaign that started from the beginning. Because after the first season, I mean, for those who weren't around, that first playoff was gangbusters. Like, no one expected that playoff to do as well as it did. And then it completely tanked the next season. I mean, ESPN had to do make goods of like $20 million to all the advertisers because, as it turns out, when the college football push comes to shove with New Year's Eve plans win. So we'll get to see that now and how it faces off. It's a little bit less daunting to take on the NFL, if that's even possible. But I'm going to be honest, taking on that New Year's Eve, that was a fiasco for the college football playoff in that 2015-2016 season. So another kind of quirk in all this is, where does Notre Dame fit?
Yeah, this was funny, right? Because I think that in some ways this is part of the genesis of this episode. It has been accepted from the beginning that Notre Dame is completely ineligible for a bye in the college football playoff under any scenario. And when you wonder, oh, well, how does Notre Dame feel about this? Their athletic director at the time, Jack Swarbrick, was one of 3 members of the working group that put together this model. It was him, Greg Sankey, and Bob Bowlesby from the Big 12 at the time. So, like, they knew. This is not a secret. This went viral like a couple months ago because people were like, what? Notre Dame can't have a bye? And anyway, like, obviously I'm a college football reporter. I'm very deep in the weeds, but yes, Notre Dame cannot have a bye. The logic for it is, well, there's 2 pieces of logic to it. One, Notre Dame values its independence. That is not changing. There is no, like, there were all these questions. Oh, well, does that mean that they're going to join a conference? No, that does not mean it. They really value being independent. They're a unique voice in college football. They're a unique place in college football. Actually, I mentioned the CFP meetings. The people who make up the CFP board of managers are the 10 commissioners of the leagues, of the FBS leagues, and also, just for some reason, Notre Dame's athletic director. He gets his own seat as an individual school on the management of the college football playoff. It's such a unique place. They get their NBC television deal, right? Like, there's a lot of reasons why they feel perfectly happy where they are. And by the way, Notre Dame's got some money, man. Like, I think Notre Dame's going to live. I think they'll be just all right. But the other piece of logic to this is, for the teams that make the college football playoff and get a bye in the first round, they would have had to have won their conference championship game. So essentially, that is almost a first college football playoff game. You have to win that game. And if you lose, you have to play another game because you don't get a bye. You're not eligible for one. So from that perspective, Notre Dame does not have that 13th game built into their schedule any year because they don't play in a conference. And so it actually evens out to where they have to win pretty much the same amount of games as everybody else in order to win a national championship, right? So I think it's 4 games that a team that's not in the top 4 needs to win to ultimately win the college football playoff. And it's going to be the same for teams that get a bye because they're going to have to win their conference championship game first. So ultimately, they're perfectly comfortable with this arrangement. And like I said, if they're number 1 in the country, doesn't matter. Not eligible for a bye. Like they're going to be the 5 seed heading into the college football playoff, and that's going to throw some people off. But this is something that they very explicitly signed up for, and they are fine with it.
Yeah, I agree. That's going to be an even wash when you consider the lack of conference title game. Now, if we still were in the era of, one true champion, or whatever, like where the top team will be ranked and get in, then maybe, okay, they'd have an argument. But at this point, they don't. And I think that's why they were completely happy with it. They can do math at Notre Dame. So therefore, it made so much sense for them. I just wanted to also just touch on the G5, because one of the awkward things that's happened is I keep mentioning Cincinnati. Obviously, they're no longer G5. Neither is UCF. Neither is, several teams that used to be perennial contenders for that spot. I mean, just this last season, a lot of people thought SMU should have been there rather than Liberty. But now, hey, starting next season, they're not G5 either. How is this going to affect it? And do you think the G5 should just savor these few years while they get them before it gets renegotiated? Or are they safe?
I think that for the next several years, they're safe. Now, it's worth noting, you said, the next 2 years, it's going to be the 12-team college football playoff. It's going to be the 5+7 model that is set in stone, that is signed, that is delivered. After that, all that's been signed is that there will be an extension on the television contract with ESPN. The playoff will be at least 12 teams. That's set in stone. It could jump to 14. That has not been decided as yet. No scenarios on buys have been created at this point. So like at this point, like they could decide that they're just going to do the top 14 at-large teams. That buys and auto bids might not be a part of it, but I don't think there's a lot of appetite for that. I don't think that there's a lot of desire for that really from almost anybody. In fact, I think that from the Big 2 conferences, the idea is more, hey, we want more auto bids and not less. We just want more of them to go to us. I think especially the Big 10 has been heavy in trying to push that. But ultimately, I do think that the group of 5 is safe. Look, so much of what's happening right now in college football is going to come down to people deciding to do, per se, the right thing. And I think that talking to Greg Sankey, especially from the SEC, I mean, he's one of the only sort of longtime athletics administrators on the list, right? Like none of the other power conference commissioners hardly. Jim Phillips is another one who came from the academic world, but like most of them don't at this point, right? Tony Petitti came from the television world. Brett Yormark came from the marketing world. Tim Pernetti taking over the AAC. He comes from a little bit of both backgrounds, but mostly the business world, right? Like this is kind of the new reality in college athletics, especially among the most powerful people. But I do think that people like Sankey and Phillips especially are like, we need to have some component in place to like keep people engaged at all, right? Like to keep people who are fans of, of Tulane, to have people who are fans of Boise State and San Diego State and Troy. Like they need to have something to be involved with the system for, right? Like I think that that's an existential issue. So I do think long term that there will be a spot for the group of 5. We can see kind of long term how real that is, how good that is, whether it ends up being a positive. I will say for everybody, not just the group of 5, but everybody that's not in the SEC or Big 10, savor these 2 years. Try to make the most of it, because I think that the most dangerous thing that could happen in this expanded playoff is the ACC champion and the Big 12 champion get wiped off the earth each of the next 2 years. The 12 seed group of 5 team gets beat real bad. And by the way, the group of 5 team is going to have a terrible matchup every single year because it's going to be the best non-champion SEC or Big 10 team every year, right? Like last year, that would have been, alignment aside, the best one of those teams would have been Georgia, right? Like the 12 seed would have played Georgia last year. That's what it's going to be in many of these seasons. But, so if all three of those teams get blown away, and especially also if the Big 12 and ACC don't have more teams that are even competing for the college football playoff, that's the danger zone. That's when we need to start to panic a little bit about the state and future of the sport. I don't think that's going to happen, especially with the ACC and Big 12 component. I actually am going to be fascinated to see, the ACC team play the 6th seed, stuff like that. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to see because there's like people always point to like, oh my gosh, Georgia blew TCU off the field. So like clearly TCU can't compete, but like maybe TCU can beat Michigan, right? Maybe TCU can beat the 7 seed. Maybe TCU can beat the 10 seed. You're not just competing with like the top 2 or 3 programs. Like you want to be able to compete with all of them. So I think ultimately that's sort of what you need to keep an eye on in the college football playoff heading forward is, you just need to show, I think that these groups need to show some semblance of competitiveness. The one other thing that I'll mention on the group of 5 front is I'm going to be fascinated to see if any programs step up, because like you said, the teams that have been great in the group of 5 over the past several years are no longer in the group of 5. With Houston, with Cincinnati, with UCF, of course, with SMU over the past couple of years rising up. Like the one consistently very good team that's sticking around is Memphis. Boise State will kind of see if they can get back to what they were a couple of years ago, but it's been a while. So like there isn't a clear team or program that is just poised to take this over. And that can be a positive or a negative, but I'm going to be curious to see, are there teams that manage to use this platform to elevate themselves? Again, we saw this to an extent with SMU. They were able to clean up in the transfer portal. They were able to say, look, you can come here and we get to play power conference teams and we get the opportunity to try and win this conference and finish in the top 25 and make a New Year's Six. I'm going to be curious to see if some programs can better make the pitch when there is a playoff spot on the line that, hey, maybe you don't have to go to the 8th best Big 10 school. Maybe it actually makes more sense for you to come here.
Yeah, all of this makes me think of an interview I had with Rocky Long at a Mountain West Media Day when he was the San Diego State head coach. And the way he phrased it, I still remember that. 1 year, because this is when they were just hoping to get an 8 team or whatever, a playoff where there would be a G5 team in there. He said 1 year, that G5 team is going to make a run and watch what happens to TV ratings. And he was convinced. I agree, because that's going to become like a Super Cinderella story. It's going to be like St. Peter's or whatever you want to look at. Every year there's an interesting story like that in basketball. So hopefully they get that kind of a thing going. One last topic I did want to touch on, and it was one of those that I thought was interesting, was the concept of how opt-outs and load management might work into this. I know Dennis wrote a bit about it, and he's talked about how it might manifest in, a conference championship game where both teams are basically playing for seeding. At that point, if you have a banged up QB or a couple of key players you might want to recover before the games really start to count, it might be this point in the season where we see that. What do you make of that? Do you think that's something we might see?
Yeah, I personally think that's a little overrated. I think that the biggest threat to players participating is just not playing meaningful games, right? Like I think that that's what people will opt out of. I don't think that people are going to opt out of games that even could be meaningful while their teams are still alive. It's going to be more, I think, when teams are no longer alive that we lose interest and that players start opting out. Like we don't see, even just as an example, I mean, Kenny Pickett opted out of the, I think it was the Peach Bowl they played in after their conference title season. There was no worry that he was going to opt out of like the ACC title game because they were out of the playoff race, right? Like, I think that was still something that was significant to their program. Clemson, obviously another example of that, right? Like, we don't see players just opt out because the big goals are gone necessarily. So I don't think that's going to be a huge issue. Now, I will say, like, I think as a collective kind of need to come and have this conversation about bowls and opt-outs. This is not so much a playoff conversation, but I remember last year, Garrett Wilson, a great receiver at Ohio State, now playing with the New York Jets, now maybe trying to force his way out because it actually sucks to play for the New York Jets. He tweeted something along the lines of, well, I would have liked to play and I really regret not playing in the Rose Bowl, but basically agents told me not to. And I think that there's this idea that players just don't feel like playing, or that, whatever it is, when really there are so many advisors right now who just frankly don't actually care about college football. I think in college sports in general, right? You see this in basketball as well. Actually, you've seen it historically much more in basketball. But there's this idea, right? I mean, I even look at a player and look, he had to leave. I'm not doubting that, and I think it was the right decision. But like, nobody has been sadder the past like 4 months than Marvin Harrison Jr., who like looks like a person who wants to do anything except enter the NFL draft. He is dying to still be playing at Ohio State right now. Like he was apparently still eating in the Ohio State cafeteria, hanging around Columbus. He didn't like do anything at Pro Day. He didn't work out for anybody. Apparently he didn't even sign his like disclosure contract to be able to start making jerseys before he signed his actual contract. Like Marvin Harrison Jr. wishes he was still playing college football right now. And I think that like societally, we can have a little bit more of a conversation where we don't dismiss what there is to achieve and accomplish in college football in general, right? Like where like these voices coming from the outside that are all NFL, contract, like especially in an NIL era, like I don't know. I'm going to be fascinated to see if there's a bit of pushback to it. Again, sorry to go on another tangent, but like real quick, like there are so many good running backs who decided to come back to college football this year because there's actually some positional value in being a running back in college football in a way that maybe can get you compensated as opposed to just rushing to the NFL. I've covered so many players over the years who are just like trying to get to the NFL as quick as possible, and then they get cut during training camp, and that's their football career. And I think that, we can find a balance here a little bit more because I think that, in some ways it's a very NBA mindset where it's like, you got to hurry and get to the league so you get through your rookie contract, so you get your second contract. And that's when you make $200 million. That's not really how it works in the NFL. Like your first contract might be your only contract in many cases, especially depending on the position group that you play. So I do hope that big picture on the opt-out front, we're able to have kind of a big conversation about like what is actually the right thing, what is actually the good thing, depending on who you are, depending on what position you play, depending on where you play, depending on what matters to you. And I hope that we do start to see some pushback long term on sort of this narrative that I think that's emerged in so many ways. Like I remember actually too, kind of on the flip side of this, probably no one has lost more because of one of these bowl injuries than Jake Butt, the former Michigan tight end. He's like the poster child for this. Him and Jalen Smith, who Jalen Smith was ultimately able to play in the NFL, but like Jake Butt kind of was screwed after his injury. Jake Butt says he never regrets playing in that game. Like he wanted to play in that game. He's glad that he did. Obviously, he wishes it ended differently. But like he is perfectly comfortable with the fact that he played in that game. And everybody is afraid of being the next Jake Butt and losing potentially out on hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. But I mean, that's kind of just football too, right? Like that's kind of just part of this, that nothing is promised, nothing is guaranteed. And we don't necessarily need to make all of our decisions solely based on the worst case scenario.
Absolutely. That is just the nature of the sport. Well, I encourage all of you, if you can get a chance, to go and read this whole article and read the latest one that Sean's got coming up, reseeding these teams at in this preseason list to give people a glimpse of what is to potentially come as we enter the regular season. We're past the off-season solstice, by the way. I love it. People have come up with this. May 2nd of this year was the halfway point between the Washington Michigan game and week 0. So we are past halfway point, people. And the good news is next season, it's going to be an even shorter off season because of this expanded playoff. But on behalf of all of us here at the College Football Survivor Show, thank you for listening. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com as well as at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Ieri. I'm part of the team that runs Reddit CFP. Thank you for listening, everybody. Have a great one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.